Welcome back to the Geek Warning podcast. My name is Ronan McLaughlin. I will be your host today as I bring you a bit of a special episode interrupting our regular broadcasting schedule to devote an episode to delving 2 feet first into the hookless debate, hookless tire conversation, hookless rim discussion, the wider hookless conversations happening following Thomas De Gendt's crash on stage 5 of the UAE Tour. Those debates, those discussions, those conversations only intensified following a remarkably similar looking incident that his teammate Johannes Ademits suffered 9 days later at the Strade Bianche race in Italy. And central to both of those incidents were Zipp, who manufacture the rims that both riders were using at the time of those incidents. The manufacturers involved, both namely Zipp and Vittoria, along with the team Lotto Destiny, have all stated since that impact, most likely with a rock, was the cause of De Gendt's incident. And, well, the result of all that is that more confusion remains around the use of hookless in a road setting. To address that confusion and some of the concerns that stem from multiple incidents involving the same team, same system, same components, I invited Zipp onto the podcast. And today I am joined by David Morse and Nathan Schickel. Apologies if I'm butchering your name, but perhaps Nathan, starting with you, can you briefly give us an introduction to yourself and what your role is at Zipp?
So I joined Zipp in 2003, and I'm currently product manager for the Zipp product line. So that's wheels, handlebar, stem, seat post.
Thank you. And David, you're also joining us today. You're also at Zipp.
Great. Yeah. Very happy to be here. Thanks, Ronan. David Morse. I started at Zipp in 2008. I spent 5 or so years as a design engineer, and then the past 9 years in our advanced development group, running all the wind tunnel testing and new product development. And then most recently, starting at the new year, I moved into a role as the wheel category manager. So looking after our product portfolio and planning the future. But thanks so much for having us. One thing I want to stress is any difficult questions you think you might have, please, we welcome them. We welcome the opportunity to talk about everything that we know.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And there undoubtedly will be some difficult questions. There are difficult questions both in my own head as a Zipp user. There are difficult questions floating around our own comment section, internet forums. There's speculation. There's all sorts of conclusions being drawn. And so, that we thought would be best put these directly to yourselves and get answers on them. I'm going to start with the article that I wrote in the aftermath of Thomas De Gendt's crash in the UAE Tour. I think it was stage 5. If you've been living under a rock, no pun intended, but if you had missed what happened there, there was an incident. Thomas De Gendt crashed at high speed. He was lucky not to be more seriously injured, I think. Got up and completed the stage. What sort of sparked a lot of controversy following that was that it appeared from the photos that emerged post race that his tire was dismounted from the rim, at least on one side. There was a tire insert that had seemingly been tangled, broken, and was entangled in the wheel and the frame, and there was sealant everywhere. The reporting that we did on that incident was that Thomas De Gendt's rim and tire were out of spec as per ISO's latest standards. We know the inner rim width of the Zipp 353 NSW rim is 25 millimeters. We had confirmed with the team that he was riding a 28 millimeter tire, and I had speculated that was at least a contributing factor within that incident. I had also said in that article that Zipp are a reputable brand, which I think is a fair statement. A brand that I would trust, a brand that I have used wheels from. But I've got to be honest, that faith has been challenged following recent events, because 9 days after that, we've seen a follow-up incident not a follow-up incident, but another incident involving another Lotto rider, Johannes Ademits at Strade Bianche. There are other incidents also seemingly involving the same wheel sets. And when you then start to sort of piece the puzzles together, Zipp are still on the website there publishing a tire compatibility chart that has a 28mm tire on it, despite what the new ISO standards say. I'm going to ask you to tell me what happened in that incident and what Zipp's findings are, having had Thomas De Gendt's wheels shipped back to your headquarters there.
Not immediately, but on the Monday after the incident, I contacted the Lotto Destiny team management. First question, is Thomas okay? We knew he'd finished the race, but obviously injuries can show up afterwards, and we were happy that he was in good stead. The report that immediately followed from the team management stated that Thomas said, "I hit something on the side of the road and I fell," and that was the end of his statement. So further information was his tire pressure was within range. It was well below 4.5 bar, which 5 bar is the maximum for that particular tire. And it was using that Corsa Pro 28mm tire that Vittoria's had on the market now for a little over a year, I think. Our tire pressure, not our tire pressure, but our tire compatibility chart has been informed by tire manufacturers because that's their responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. So, when Vittoria launched that tire, they informed us that they felt it was compatible with our wheels, and we've made sure that they have our wheels in their testing facility so that they can test specifically on our wheels. So that was the initial portion of this, and so from that perspective, we expected the wheel to be impacted. It took some time. We got the wheel back, and we've looked at it, and all of the damage to the wheel is very consistent with a pretty major impact. So obviously, Zipp's been around a while, and we've impact tested thousands of wheels over the years, and we have a pretty clear understanding of what that looks like. But just to make sure that we had our bases covered, we also did further impact testing, and we realized that the impact was at the very top level of where we see impact values, right? So to cause that much damage, it was a very major impact. So the downside of carbon fiber bicycle wheels is that, and it doesn't really matter if it's a hooked or a hookless system, once that rim structure is damaged, especially in an impact, the tire is going to come off. So that structure is there to hold the tire on. Once that structure is gone, the tire is going to come off, and that's what happened in that particular incident.
Yeah, and I mean, Zipp has released photos of the rim since, and those photos were published last week. I think when I'm looking at those photos, what I see, and I'm not an engineer, so this is a question, but what I see is it clearly as the rim has failed, it's broken. That to me looks like an impact with a square edge, sort of blunt object. The rim is broken, right the way across its width, perpendicular to the sidewalls, and seemingly in one place from one sidewall to the other. That, in my head at least, doesn't match up with the sort of damage you would expect from a random rock. That to me, it looks like something that would happen if you struck a curb or a footpath or a deep pothole. I've watched the video back a million times since. The only thing really notable about that stretch of road that the incident happened on is that there was. It's a terrible video, I have to admit, but from what I've seen, and I've found a wider view of it, the only thing notable about that stretch of road is that there is nothing notable about it. At first, it looks like to me that De Gendt is right on the verge, and perhaps had moved onto the rough surface underneath the sort of central reservation. But yeah, when you see the wider shot, it seems like that the area between the yellow line and the central reservation is much wider, and that Thomas was within that section. So yeah, is that strike or that impact damage consistent with the rock, or is it consistent with the sort of object that I'm imagining?
So we don't know what the shape of the object is that he hit. But it is clearly impact damage. When we got the wheel back, we did a dissection to confirm that the laminate was intact as prescribed, meaning all the layers of carbon were where they were supposed to be, and the failure occurred where we would expect an impact failure to initiate. It's funny when you bring up the video. When I look at the video, it's actually fairly clear. I can see when De Gendt's helmet drops, when I suspect that's when his wheel collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
You can see a piece of debris fly seemingly from his wheel, which I suspect is the piece of the rim that's missing from the impacted wheel. And if you follow the road back from the instant that his helmet drops, you can see a rock between some wheels or some shadowy object that looks like a rock. You mentioned the video is pretty poor. Being on the edge of the roadway, it wouldn't be surprising to me if there was a piece of crumbling asphalt or a piece of construction debris or something on the roadway that got pushed to the margin where he was riding. So there's no telling what the shape of the object that he hit, but in the video, it's pretty convincing to me. If you step frame by frame, there is something in the road and it lines up to where his front wheel was when his helmet indicates something happened. His hands flipped off the handlebars or his wheel collapsed or something happened there. It's really unfortunate the footage is that bad. And then the still images of the bike on the side of the road don't really give us any more insight as well. The tire is kind of shadowing the wheel to see what's going on. So I think that might be where a lot of the speculation came from, is that it wasn't clear what exactly had happened. If you take some time and go frame by frame in the video, there's pretty convincing evidence to me that there was something in the road that lined up when he crashed. But that being said, the report from the rider was that he hit something. The report from Vittoria was that there was an impact. When we kind of held off our judgment until we got our hands on the wheel. But what we see in the wheel that we received from Lotto Destiny is consistent with what we see in impact damage. One thing to note on composite wheels is they're under enormous hoop stress from both spoke tension and tire pressure. So there's a lot of force going through the carbon fiber circumferentially. And when you damage the wheel in an impact, it starts to fracture, and the fracture starts to spread because of that hoop stress that's on the wheel. So it's not surprising to me if the impact did say propagate from one side to the other, if it were impacted on a portion of the rim, that it would crack all the way through because the structure's been affected by the initial impact with the rock or object. All that to say, there aren't really any question marks for us after looking at the wheel and hearing reports from the rider.
Okay. Is it fair then to, perhaps it's not fair to assume anything in this case, but given the quality of the video, we do have to make some assumptions, I think. But is it fair to assume that whatever the object was, it must have been at least the width of the rim? Is that fair?
Not necessarily. Like I said, if you have one of the two straight sides cracked, it's completely reasonable to expect that crack would propagate across the entire wheel because of the enormous stress that is preloaded into any built wheel with a tire inflated on it. I mean, we're talking several tons of compressive force on the carbon structure. Just like, I don't know if you've ever seen the trick, you can stand on a Coke can, an empty Coke can, if you do it carefully, and then as soon as you touch the side of the Coke can, the whole thing collapses because there's that preload. You've affected the structure of the Coke can. Carbon wheels are extremely strong, and they need to be primarily because they have to support a lot of hoop stress when they get built and inflated. If a portion of the wheel were damaged from an impact, it's not surprising to me that the crack propagates entirely through the rim.
The reason I ask that is because the most notable thing to me when I watched that video, having spent hours and probably when you tally it up, maybe years with inside a peloton like that, and there, again, we can't see much in the video, but the notable thing to me was that there was no reaction from any other riders in front or to the side of De Gendt. After, behind him, obviously everybody reacts to him going down. But the reason I ask that question is because it seems to me if there was an object big enough to cause an impact severe enough to cause damage like this on the rim, all the riders would have seen it and would have been calling it out or would have been reacting to it or some sort of deviation in their line. I just didn't see that.
Unfortunately, the video is two-dimensional. Maybe you can bring more detail to this, but I remember hearing someone reference that the peloton had shifted and that De Gendt was off to the side by himself. I don't know if that's true.
So when I was watching it, and I've said this a couple times, but I'm really happy that we get the Eurosport feeds in the US now, so we can watch them. And so as I saw it, the group was on the left side of the road and it's sort of in a crosswind, and it looked as if the front shifted. I don't know if somebody just twitched or somebody braked or what happened, but it seemed like there was sort of a ripple moving back through the line. And it was just after that Thomas De Gendt went down. And so, none of us were there. So that's the unfortunate side of it. And the photo wasn't from behind or above, it was from the side where we're occluded. So, I hate making assumptions, and I hate giving my professional, unprofessional opinion of watching a video, right? But that's what I saw.
The one other thing I want to ask related to the Gendt's crash and what we can see in the video is we can see if you slow it down, you go frame by frame, and I've gone frame by frame and taken screenshots and then used Photoshop to change the contrast and the lighting and all sorts to try and find something. I haven't seen that object. I'm happy to be showing it. But one thing you can see is what appears to be some shard of carbon fiber flying through the air after whatever has happened to De Gendt. Unfortunately, De Gendt his wheels are sort of hidden whenever what happens. But you can clearly see a shard of carbon fiber. That to me is also sort of, and again, I'm not an engineer, but it seems consistent with an explosion of some sort. Is there a chance that a crack in the rim bed could have allowed the pressure within the tire to pressurize that rim cavity and cause an explosion that way, and a failure? Could that explain it?
So there's a lot of pent up energy in an inflated tire. That's one of the reasons why we sometimes will do inflation tests with water, because it's incompressible. So once the rim bed is cracked, undoubtedly you're going to get some evacuation of that pressure into the rim cavity. But I don't think that amount of energy compares to the amount that's being released from the fractured rim. Like I said, that all that hoof stress that's built in once you break that through. It's not surprising to me, again, that there's some kind of ejection from the sidewall of the rim like that. There are a lot of dynamics that are happening when you hit a rock in a peloton going whatever 45, 50K an hour. So I don't think that it's not surprising, but also there's so many things that can cause that to happen. It's not fair to speculate that any one thing caused it to fly off like that.
I think my question here is because having hit a heck of a lot of things over the last 20 years of bike riding at various different speeds, both fast and slow, the rim failure that we're seeing here is not something that I've seen previously. And I'll give you an example of a race I did in France in 2008 where it was pouring rain, the roads were flooded. Trying to be a smart aleck, I thought I could cut a footpath and get to the front of the peloton. What I didn't realize that the footpath I was about to bunny hop onto, the big puddle in front of it was actually hiding a manhole or a pothole or something like that. So as I pressed down to bunny hop up, I full force at about 40k an hour put my front wheel into whatever was beneath that water, with such force that it actually ripped the forks. Just snapped them in two, ripped the front wheel and the fork straight out of the frame. But the tire was still on the rim. The rim was destroyed, but it wasn't as severe as what we're seeing here. And then when I compare that to what I am seeing here, which is a seemingly smooth stretch of road, you kind of, the questions start, you naturally start questioning how much impact could you find on a road like that?
Yeah, I think I'll just go back to the idea that we have several sources that are independent of each other that are all pointing in the same direction. And there's a publicly available source of information in the video that I think I would be very happy to show you what I see in the video as the rock. In terms of the severity of the impact, our job at Zipp is to study impacted wheels. And as Nate mentioned, we have thousands of impacted wheels in our lab that we can study, and we cross-reference those with any warranty returns. I think a topic that we might touch here would be the fact that we have a lifetime warranty. And one of the benefits of a Zipp of having a lifetime warranty is to incentivize all of our riders to return any damaged product to us. So we have a surprisingly small warranty return rate for impacts, but given the volume of wheels that we sell, we do see impact damaged wheels come back to us. And this informs a lot of what we would expect in impact damage. And correlate that to what we see in the lab. So the failure modes we see are consistent. We want to make sure that our lab testing is representative of what goes on in the real world. And we've spent a lot of effort and energy to make sure that that's the case and that we're properly testing in our lab. Again, this all points to the idea that what we've seen come back from the Lotto Destiny wheels is consistent with major impact damage.
We'll perhaps not dwell on Adam Eates' incident for too long, because we're focusing on De Gendt's because there is video footage of it, and there's more photos of the aftermath also. But briefly speaking, do you want to just tell us what Zipp's explanation is for the Adam Eates incident?
Yeah, I can take that. So, a bit of background, Ronan. At Strada Bianchi, normally we counsel our teams to use a wheel like a 303 Firecrest and a 30 millimeter tire, because Strada Bianchi is like a cobbled race. It is like a gravel race. It's a race where you want a larger tire. That said, in previous editions, in 2022, we had a rider on Movistar, Alejandro Valverde, finish in second place on 353s on 28 millimeter tires. So it's not an unheard of combination. The report that we received again from Lotto Destiny, with Johan giving us his description of what happened, he stated that he hit something at high speed. He wasn't sure what he saw. He was in the group, so he didn't see it. It was just he hit something at high speed. He said, nothing felt wrong, so I continued to ride. Later on, the tire flatted, and I continued to ride. And then it wasn't until that the tire came off the wheel after having been ridden flat did he stop. And he stated, I did not crash and I was not hurt. The race of Strada Bianchi, it's a pretty damaging race, but it's also a hilly race, and riders are looking for every advantage they can have. So they're more apt to choose a lighter weight wheel set. And that's the choice that was made here. I'm not criticizing that choice, because obviously we've had that particular wheel set finish on the podium. But, what we saw here was a racing incident. It's a dirt road. He struck something along the dirt road. He continued to do his job and do what professional riders do, which is a little different from what everybody else does, which is I had a flat and I continued to ride my bike. So most everybody, when you have a flat, you stop, you get off and you fix it, right? Pros don't do that. And he continued to ride it until the tire came off.
Okay, I mentioned at the start that there are other incidents that have happened recently. I think around this time last year was one with a Q36.5 rider on a Zipp rim again. There was another one that a photo emerged of with a Movistar rider this season. There is, to be fair, there is an incident involving a Movistar rider where the tire comes off, and there's a video circulating of the rear tire having come off a Zipp rim. And the snippet shown just shows the rider standing beside the road with the tire off. When you find the entire footage of that incident, you can see the rider is clearly riding a flat tire until the point where the tire comes off the rim. So I'm not involving that. I'm not including that as an incident or like if you ride a clincher type tire, regardless of the wheel or the wheel system, the tire will eventually come off. The point I'm trying to get to the question I'm trying to get to is Zipp just going through an incredibly terrible run of bad luck for me to be able to point to multiple incidents? It seems like excessively bad luck or a problem of some sort.
I think that the impact damage week after week that we saw with Lotto Destiny is a case of terrible luck. The one thing that I'd like to highlight, though, is that all Zipp wheels adhere to a dimensional standard, the ISO standard. Our wheels measure the same as any other TSS rim, and per the standard, it's the it's the rim manufacturer's responsibility to make sure that they're putting out product that meets the dimensional standard. And beyond that, it's the tire manufacturer's responsibility to make sure that their tires function with an ISO standard rim. So in the cases that we're seeing tires seemingly with fitment issues, I would just reiterate the point that our wheels fit the dimensional standard set by ISO. Mm-hmm. And beyond that, it's the tire manufacturer's responsibility to make sure their tires function with an ISO standard wheel.
There's a lot to unpack on ISO standards, and I do plan to get back to it later. But if we can take from everything we've just covered so far, it's that impact strikes where responsible for the failures or the incidents that we've seen, and not some sort of an issue with hookless systems from what Zipp was saying.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I would oppose the notion that the hookless design or Zipp wheel impact integrity was anything to do with the standards we set for our design, were anything to do with the incident there. At some point, if you hit a carbon wheel hard enough, you should expect it to break. And in this case, racing is pretty rough on wheels. So the outcome is unfortunate, but some things like that are unavoidable sometimes.
The other thing that needs to be kept in mind is, at both the UAE Tour and Strade Bianche, we had 3 teams in each of those races. So we had both. We had not only Lotto Destiny, we had Q365, and we had Movistar. And Q365 shares the same tire sponsor. It's pretty easy to realize that there were riders riding on the very same setup or a very similar setup to what De Gendt was riding on, with finishing the race with no problems.
Mm-hmm.
And Strade Bianche, same cases, same teams. So same outcome. One rider has a problem. The other riders, I think it's 8 riders per team these days. So, that means 23 other riders finished the race or got to their finish point in the race, whatever that was, without a problem. So we sort of have to look at it from that standpoint. These are incidents that are isolated, and there are other riders finishing the same race with no issues.
And I guess one more point I'd like to bring up, maybe Nate, you can bring more detail into this, is the idea that the 28 millimeter label size tire is not appropriate for a 25 millimeter internal rim. Per ISO standard, now that is not a recommended size compatibility, but up until recently it had been, and we have actually a lot of history with that combination and good success with the two.
Yeah, I mean, just looking back through calendar year 2023, so we have multiple men's World Tour teams, multiple women's World Tour teams, and several teams racing Pro Conti here in the United States. And so when you add all of those up, that's 4,000 race days per rider. So like 8,000 race days per wheel, 2 wheels per rider. And we have less than a 1% incidence of an issue. And that issue is a broken spoke, a broken or damaged rim, or a hub issue. So that's all of those combined. It is excluding crash damage because we look at those in a different manner. But from that perspective, we feel that shows that we've got a really good usage rate. And other than the cobbled classics, riders are riding on 28 millimeter tires. So, and for a lot of those teams, the 303 or 353 are their go-to wheel. So that means it's a 28 millimeter on a 25 millimeter rim.
Yeah, I do want to get back to ISO standards and devote a section of the podcast to that. So we'll get back to that later. What I want to get to now, though, is that, regardless of everything we've just heard, there will be Zipp riders. I have Zipp rims here myself, and those riders may, well, I'm not even going to say may, reading the comments, reading the messages sent to me, there are riders with concerns that if an impact is to blame for the failures that we have seen, can they be confident going out on their own training rides? Like if I think about the roads around here, they're either terrible surfaces or they're terrible surfaces with a lot of potholes. Or a third option, there are terrible surfaces with a lot of potholes and rocks. And I kind of debris, let's say, maybe not rocks. Or what can you tell a listener to reassure them that these sorts of impact failures are not going to happen next time they're going down a descent at 50 kilometers per hour? I'm trying to replicate the conditions that these riders might have seen, trying to replicate the speed.
Yeah. One thing I can lend for that is from our dissection, we understand that Dent's wheel was properly constructed as we would expect of anything coming out of our factory, which implies to us that the impact must have been major. We also do extensive internal impact testing when we're validating a design and validating our manufacturing processes. And the standard we set for impact failure on all of our road wheels is identical. So our highest end NSW wheels, the lightest ones we make, have to pass the same impact standards as our 303 Firecrest, which is intended for gravel racing. Hopefully that brings a little bit of comfort knowing that everything is passing the same strict impact requirements. And our tubeless straight side rims today are roughly 40% more impact resistant than the tubulars that we previously were manufacturing for use in the World Tour and in professional racing. So our rims today are more impact resistant than we used to produce. And the highest level rims that we produce have the same impact standards they have to pass than anything else we make. Our internal impact standards are more stringent than the minimum requirement for UCI and ISO, that 40 joule standard. So just rest assured that we are holding ourselves to a higher standard than the minimum required for World Tour racing. And the rims we produce today are more impact resistant than tubulars raced successfully in the past.
I think we'd all agree that 40 joule impact test on ISO, yeah, it isn't really going to cut it in. And I know this sort of, a lot of testing will look at perhaps 3 times that figure for the simple impact test. Can you give us a rating for the NSW rims in terms of what sort of joules you are seeing them fail at, and what sort of joules you might be able to calculate for the Gendt incident?
Well, I would first want to ask what is informing that 40 joules is not sufficient. That's might be a rhetorical question, but I don't know that it's not sufficient. The other thing is how you test, what implement you use to test, and the protocol will influence the energy value of the failure. So by saying, you've seen a lot of rims that test 3 times the requirement.
Sorry, I didn't say I'd seen a lot of rims. I've been told that a lot of testing will go to 3 times that sort of. Yeah.
To me, 3 times 40 joules, 120 joules is more than what we test our competitor and our own enduro wheels to. So that number doesn't make a lot of sense to me for a road wheel when it's exceeding what our competitor enduro mountain bike wheels will fail under. So again, it just comes back to how you test will inform what energy value you expect to see. And what ours test to, the standard that we hold all of our wheels to, is significantly higher than the 40 joules from the UCI impact test. Now, the 40 joule impact test in the UCI does have a specific protocol. We test to a slightly different method that we think more accurately reflects what happens outside in the real world. And again, our internal test is more stringent and more difficult to pass than the UCI protocol.
Can you describe that test, or
the internal test? I can't describe. No, the UCI test. So we used to have a horizontal impact tester here with an enormous sled, like 150 kilogram sled. It had a specific curb shape that would then roll towards the fixed wheel. You would impact it at a specific spot on the wheel and look at the damage. There was a qualitative aspect to the test where you had to make sure that there were no open fractures that they would deem dangerous. But so I mean. Is there any other detail you'd like to know about that test?
I mean, when you say you don't use the UCI test, I'm assuming you still have to do it to get approval for the rim. Yeah. So that's still done to a pass fail, I think is how it's described, and Zipp rims must be passing it to be used in the World Tour. Is that a fair assumption? What my understanding of most ISO testing, and this is based on every conversation I've ever had with a manufacturer, they've and we've been talking about ISO standards, what they've said is you need to go above and beyond the ISO standard, because the ISO standard isn't adequate for the likes of World Tour racing.
We look at the ISO standard as that's the first checkbox that we have to pass. And so we pass that checkbox, and then we move on to our own internal standards that have been built on our 30 years of history making carbon wheels.
I think that's why the internal testing would be of interest to listeners now, is because if we know the ISO, based on other manufacturers' suggestion over years that the ISO is not up to standard, it would be nice to know what sort of testing is done to go above and beyond that for Zipp to determine that the rims are fit for use in a World Tour environment.
Yeah, we'll have to consider that. I don't know if we're prepared to reveal the protocols there. Maybe we can ask around other wheel manufacturers if they'd be willing to share as well. But that's our concern, is we don't want to give away some of our competitive advantages. Understanding what you need to build a wheel to survive in the world is a key part of engineering a good bicycle wheel, and testing the wheel is critical in that pursuit.
One of the things I would like to understand, if we go back to World Tour racing, is, okay, De Gendt, you've said that you found the object in the video that he hit. What I'm still confused by is that single impact resulted in this catastrophic damage. And when I compare that to another World Tour race like Paris-Roubaix, how does that single impact differ from a sector full of impacts at Roubaix? I would have assumed that if a rim can survive a full sector of cobbles at Roubaix, especially something like Arenberg, it's not going to have an issue with a single impact. But then on the flip side, if it's not surviving a single impact, how are you going to fare when you get to Roubaix?
That highlights an exception or a question mark in our head as well, and that's part of the reason why we think that De Gendt must have hit something pretty exceptional in the race, because we know we have product that does survive the toughest races in the World Tour. And the wheel that we got back from the UAE Tour was manufactured to our specification. So it wasn't like it had a defect in it or anything like that. But what you're saying, yeah, we don't exactly know what he hit, but we suspect it must have been something pretty hard or substantial, given that we do have product that does pretty well in other races.
As we look at our wheels, and it's something that's on our website under our wheel chooser, is, we do outline our wheels by use case. And so when we look at a wheel set like a 303 Firecrest that is designed to be the great wheel for road racing, the great wheel for cobble racing, the great wheel for cyclocross, and the great wheel for gravel, that's designed from a use case perspective to be able to withstand a little bit more abuse than, say, a 353 and SW, which is designed for good road surface road racing. So that said, they both have to pass our absolute bar from an impact perspective. And so we see that, but also too, within our testing, if we outline a different use case, we'll see higher impact values for a wheel like the 303 Firecrest. So, and that's why a wheel like the 303 Firecrest is the wheel that we specifically prescribe for Paris-Roubaix, the most abusive race on the planet. Doesn't matter what race it is. Like, there's no race that's more abusive than that. So, that's the wheel set that was specifically designed for it. And then our other wheel sets are designed for other purposes, if that makes sense.
And I'd also classify the difference between the objects that you hit. So the shape of the object will have a large influence on what kind of energy the wheel can absorb before it fails. Roubaix is super rough on equipment, but a lot of the bulls or the cobbles, the pave, are quite rounded on top. Occasionally, you'll hit a missing cobble, and you'll hit a pretty sharp edge, and usually that's where a lot of the failures come from. But again, we don't really know what the shape or size of the object was that Thomas hit on the road. I suspect that it had to be something exceptional to produce a failure like that.
There was, judging off the claimed weights at the time of launch and the claimed weights now on the Zipp website, there seems to have been an increase in claimed weights for the NSW rims of late. Can you give me a bit of background on why that happened, and is that related?
Yeah, it's not directly related. So throughout our production, we're constantly monitoring scrap rates, and what we were noticing was in wheel build, we were seeing scrap in the rims, specifically with the spoke holes. So we went through an exercise to improve the robustness of the spoke holes, and in that, the rims gained enough weight that we felt it was a large enough change that it would dissatisfy a customer if we maintained our weight on the website. So instead of just shipping out a product that we knew was heavier and could disappoint a customer, we changed that well ahead of instituting it in production, so that the weight on the website more reflected what was being delivered to the rider. The second portion of that was that through the pandemic, we now mold carbon rims both in SRAM's carbon facility in Taiwan as well as here in Indianapolis. And while we use the same processes and we test to the same testing levels, we use different carbon vendors from each facility. So as we looked at that, and as we were specifically looking at the spoke hole weight gain, we also did an audit of carbon rims at both facilities to understand what was going on. And so it's been a habit of Zipp to report the 90th percentile heaviest wheel as the weight that we advertise, so that we know that generally most customers are going to receive a wheel at or below the advertised weight. What we realized was between the two facilities, there were some differences. And so we chose the heavier of those two 90th percentile weights, and that's what we advertise.
Okay, so it's not related to failures or warranty return rates or impact strikes or...
No, it was to improve the robustness of the spoke holes, and then it was also to unify our weights between the two factories.
Just on while I've mentioned it there, the warranty rate, can you tell us, is the NSW line warranty return rate in line with other rims that Zipp has manufactured or currently offers?
Yeah, so that's something that we, again, mentioning the lifetime warranty that we offer on all of our wheels. This is a warranty replacement against any manufacturing defects as well as breakages that happen within the intended use case of the wheels. As I also mentioned, again, we get a lot of these wheels back to evaluate, and it gives us a really close pulse on what's happening to our product in the field. So this gives us a really good understanding of if our testing is up to spec, if our designs are up to spec, and it brings us a lot of insight into how our products are performing.
Finally, just on the design then, the NSW range features the toroidal, the wavy profile. I have a difficulty with that word for some reason, but the rim profile that I'm referring to, the undulating rim depth. Is there any additional challenges in creating a rim like that? I'm wondering, when Nathan, you've mentioned one of the reasons for that weight increase was around the spoke holes. If I'm correct in remembering, those spoke holes are located on the higher portion of that undulating rim profile. Is there any connection there, or is there any extra challenge in designing a rim like that?
From a composite standpoint, yes, they're a little bit more challenging and labor intensive. The prominent part of the hyperfoil node, if you want to talk about the marketing language for it, those are specifically reinforced to take the load of spoke tension. So when Nate's talking about the increased rate of scrap we saw in our wheel build, we had to reinforce those nodes, and that's where we added the weight.
One question I have seen pop up is, how is the relative static test of pressurizing a tire up to 1.x times the design pressure comparable to the dynamic of a tire suddenly hitting a bump? That's a question I've seen pop up.
Yeah, that's something that we actually, so we had an operating theory, and we hadn't actually put together the equipment to test the theory. But the operating theory was, while the tire is compressed, the tire also moves concentric or eccentric of the wheel. So when the tire is compressed, you also have the tire moving eccentric of the wheel, and so the volume doesn't change that much. That was our operating theory. Just immediately after the Gent's incident, we acquired special data acquisition equipment to be able to measure tire pressure at a rate of 1,000. Is it 1,000 hertz? 1,000
Yep.
times a second.
Yep.
So, and so we did perform impacts on that particular tire and wheel setup. So a 700x28 Corsa Pro with an insert on a 353, performing impacts up to and beyond and up to failure of the wheel. And what we saw was, no matter where the impact was in relation to the valve stem, we saw a maximum increase of 4 psi.
Okay.
So the average increase was around 3.5 psi, but the maximum increase, so that maximum impulse of increase in pressure, was 4 psi. So, and that was something that we saw across multiple wheels, multiple tests.
I want to, off the back of that, I want to give you an example. if someone is using a tubeless straight side rim of any type and they are at the ISO limit of 73 psi, they believe they are because they have a home pump that has a gauge and accuracy of 10%, so they're actually closer to 80 psi. That 4 psi that you've mentioned there from the impact, is that enough to bump the tire up to max inflation? Is it enough to blow it off the rim? How does that, say if we add all those together and we somehow get to 85, 90 psi, is that enough to remove a tire from a rim?
So specific to that, one of the tests that we do to validate the tire retention on our rims is we have an inflation test, and we'll do that with multiple brands and models of tires. That particular test is based on the ISO test, but it is beyond it. So in the ISO test, there's a 5-minute hold. We have a 1-hour hold. And then we go to 150% of the maximum tire pressure, tire or wheel pressure, whichever is the lowest. So in some cases, when you have a 30 millimeter tire, the ISO max tire pressure is actually 65 PSI. So we would use that versus the 72.5 PSI, which our wheels are rated to. So because that is for that system, that is the max tire pressure. Does that make sense, Ronan?
It makes sense to me. I think there will be a lot of listeners who perhaps, and perhaps not listeners to this podcast, but there will be a lot of writers who that perhaps doesn't make sense to.
I'll outline it a little bit more straightforward. So specific to the test that we've done most recently, just reconfirming that particular system, the Corsa Pro with the 353, we start the tire at 50 PSI, hold it for an hour. Every hour thereafter, we increase by 10 PSI until there's a failure, whether it's a rim failure or the tire comes off the rim. And what we're seeing is generally in the neighborhood of 150%. So there is variance in tires, there is variance in wheels, so we see that change a little bit across samples, but generally we're seeing 150% of maximum tire pressure. Okay,
and 150% of the 73, is that if you had a 28 mil tire on a 353 NSW, 150% of that limit would be close to 110 psi, which I joked recently is around about the pressure we used to deflate our tires to on wet days. Only about 15 years ago. So I think it's understandable how that users might not be aware of those restrictions and could somehow end up at that 110 psi. Do we think that's high enough? Should Zipp be going higher than that? Is it on Zipp or is that on tire manufacturer at that point?
Really, so when we do our inflation testing, it's to validate the rim design. The safety factor that tire manufacturers test to and design to is their strategy. I think 150% is a great target for a couple of different reasons. We've rationalized that on our side, we like to see a bare minimum if you're to account for someone who maybe overinflates intentionally a little bit, has a faulty gauge, happens to inflate in an air-conditioned house that then goes out to really hot tarmac and goes high, maybe like 5,000 feet higher in altitude. So this compounding of these effects to increase the pressure in the rim, we found that could be somewhere around 35% over. And then you add a little bit extra for some extra security. That's our humility factor of understanding that maybe there's some things that we haven't accounted for, but 150% for our max inflation to blow off, we feel like is a pretty secure rate. And that's what we see with a lot of tires that we test.
Can you tell me what influences that tire retention and the max inflation pressure? Because having lived in the ISO standards for the past month or so, my understanding is that the rim dimensions are set. They're defined in ISO 5775 to 2021. And yeah, I'm just curious. Will that 150% you test to that? Is that a design that you've implemented to get there? Could you go beyond that? Are others below it? Yeah. What influences that retention max pressure?
Sure. So there are 5 factors that we've identified that influence the maximum inflation pressure before a tire blows off. You'll have the measured width of the tire, the starting nominal diameter of the bead, the stiffness of the tire, so how hard that tire is to stretch outward. And then you have the OD of the rim and the bead seat diameter, the shelf diameter of the rim. So those are the things, if you know all of those, you can pretty closely predict when the tire is going to blow off. The standard indicates a G height, which is the difference between the bead shelf diameter and the OD of the rim. The G height doesn't actually dictate when the tire comes off. It's a way of controlling the OD in relation to the bead seat diameter, but really the BSD, or the bead seat diameter shelf, keeps the tire concentric to the OD. And so if, as you inflate the tire, the beads actually stretch and lift off that bead seat diameter. So they're floating, not touching the bead seat diameter when it's in use. And the tire seals against the vertical sidewall of the straight sides to make that air seal. So the larger the bead seat diameter, the better it can keep the tire concentric to the OD. And then the OD really is the barrier that keeps the beads from popping over. So those beads have to physically stretch until they are larger than the OD until it can come off. There is some eccentricity that will degrade the max blow-off pressure. So if your tire is sitting slightly eccentric, like by 0.5 millimeter or more, that will influence when the tire blows off. So the assumptions that we're working on is that worst case scenario, the tire will sit slightly eccentric, and that's what we're using to estimate when the tire is going to blow off. And so those are some of the factors that are the major direct contributors to tire retention.
You've mentioned a lot of codes from ISO standards there, so I'm going to break them down for the listener here. We've got, and the ones that I have, reading straight from the ISO standard, there's a diagram in there that lays out the dimensions specified for tubeless straight side rims. And they are that D1, the rim diameter, should be 621.95 with a tolerance of plus or minus 0.5. That's where the 622 rim diameter code comes from that we know as a road rim, a 622. The H is the max well depth, and that's the sort of, for listeners, if you imagine the channel with inside the rim where the tire sort of sits before it's inflated. The max well depth, according to ISO, should be 2.9 to 3.5 mil. The G, which you've mentioned there, David, is the flange height, or again, for the listeners, in other terms, that's if you picture the sidewall of the rim where your tire is adjacent to, that flange height, as defined by ISO, is 6 millimeters plus or minus 0.5. And the well width, again, going back to that central channel, the well width is also listed at, I think it's 7 millimeters off the top of my head. I haven't got that marked here for some reason, but I'm pretty sure and pretty certain saying it's 7 mil. What isn't defined, though, is the OD, or the outer diameter. And I believe that's because the rim diameter plus the flange height determines what your outer diameter should be. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then there's a stack up of tolerances that would lead to a range of ODs that are within spec. But understanding, on our side, understanding that the OD is a major driver of inflation and tire retention, we tightly control our OD and our BSD, and then just make sure that the combination of the two meets the G height specification that we need to hold.
Yeah, because in trying to write an article on for riders who currently have hookless rims, trying to give the checklist that I use before I'll go out on a ride with the hookless rims, which I've done as recently as yesterday, I will say, to sort of give myself confidence in using that system. I have a checklist. One of those checks involves measuring the G height, which I'm not sure if Zipp is going to agree with me, but I'm going to say you can do with a set of vernier calipers and the depth gauge. You need to be very accurate, and you also need a highly accurate pair of calipers. But it can be done. When I measure the G height for the Zipp 858 NSWs that I have here, it's 5.51, which is 0.01 of a millimeter within the tolerance. That seems to me very low on the section of the rim wall that is the only part of the wheel that my tire is adjacent to.
Yeah, please allow me to go into why I think that 5.51 is okay. It's within spec.
I want to be clear. It is within spec. It's very, very close for me.
Yeah. So I'll go into why I think that that's okay, and then I'll go into how we measure that to make sure all of our rims fall within specification. The two major drivers for tire retention, or what determines your maximum pressure before the tire blows off, is going to be the outer diameter absolute value and the bead seat diameter absolute value. The G height is a resultant, the subtraction of those two values. So you can imagine if your BSD, if the bead shelf were at the bottom of the ISO spec and your G height were at the bottom of the ISO spec, your OD would be quite small and your blow-off pressure would be quite low, but that would be in spec. Additionally, if your BSD were at the top of the ISO spec and your G height were at the minimum of the ISO spec, that would retain tires quite well. In both cases, the G height is small, but the blow-off value is quite different.
Just a question on that. Is the example you're giving there a BSD plus 0.5 of a mil above the spec and a G height minus 0.5 of a mil, and you effectively end up in the same place? Is that...
So you could have, let me do the math quickly in my head. I think it's, so G height is on the radius and the BSD and the OD are on diameter. So you could be 0.75 plus or minus on the OD. You could be from nominal, you could be 0.75 low or 0.75 high. That's a 1.5 millimeter swing on your OD. And both of those could yield the same G height, but they would have drastically different inflation results. So my point there is that G height really isn't a good indicator of inflation or tire retention. It's more the absolute value of the OD and the absolute value of the bead shelf diameter. Okay. But acknowledging that if you wanted to measure G height in your wheels, you could. It's a simple enough measurement. It's probably the simplest of all of them to measure. Mm-hmm. Just I wouldn't freak out if it's close to the edge of the spec.
If it was below, would that be a red flag?
Not necessarily. I mean, it would technically be out of spec, but if it were out of spec on the high side, what that would mean is your tires would probably seat at a higher pressure than typical, but also that depends on the stiffness and the nominal diameter of the tire itself. So really, the OD being and the bead shelf being too low are what you should be concerned about. If the G height is within spec, maybe that's one small indication that they're following ISO spec, but I wouldn't read too far into it, honestly. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the way that we validate our designs. So if you want to measure the diameter of the OD and the diameter of the bead shelf, you can buy what's called a pi tape. It's a straight measuring tape that's been divided by pi. So if you wrap the pi tape around a circumference and you line it up just right, it'll tell you what the diameter, and it's relatively accurate. It's for a hand tool, that's about as good as you're going to get.
Just before we move on from that, sorry, I have my pi measurement tape ordered. It's not here yet, but it's on the way. Yeah, and that's not specifically for the Zipp rim I have sitting here. That's for all hookless wheels that I will inevitably have to ride. The other measurements I just wanted to touch on before we move on from this, though, are that the max well depth and the well width. And the reason I want to ask about those is because they're the other two things that I can easily measure here. Again, you'll be within your rights to question my measurement accuracy, but they are elements of the rim that I can measure here. The hitch or the unobstructed max well depth, including rim tape, for me, it's measuring above that, and the well width again is measuring above it. And my takeaway from that is that would make for a rim that would make tire mounting easier. Is there any sort of temptation to design a rim on the outer limits of what's acceptable to increase tire seating or make it easier to mount a tire?
Yeah, tire installation is influenced by the depth of that well. And then the air seal before the beads hook up on the shelf is influenced by the width of the well. So you want the tire to be able to be installed without tools, ideally. So you're not breaking your thumbs and you're not ripping the tire with a tire iron or anything like that. And then once the tire is installed, you want the beads to have enough contact with the rim well to hold some pressure to allow that pressure to lift everything up, lift the beads of the tire up onto the shelf of the rim. So to make the things that drive tire installation or to make it easier would be you want to decrease OD and decrease the well depth. Now, I just said that the OD drives inflation. So we don't want to decrease the OD just to make the tires easier to install. We want to keep that as high as possible. And then we drive the well depth to the lower limit of the spec to make it as easy as possible to install.
Is there, like, if you have got a deeper well depth, is there any risk that in the event of a rapid deflation increases the chances of a tire dismounting the rim?
It depends if your tire is prone to falling back in the well. So the shape of the beads on your tire will influence after a flat, after you lose pressure, whether that tire will sit squarely on the shelf or if it will roll into the well. Once the beads are in the well, then there is some slack and there is potential for the tire to come over the OD at that point. But that is the same chance with any tubeless wheel. So
is that something you test for? Is that something that can be tested for?
Right now, we don't have a dynamic test in the lab. That's something that we just see with use, and we do extensive ride testing. We actually have a pretty big ride test team that gets all of our prototype wheels out on the road, and we log the miles diligently to detect any issues like that. So not a lab test, but we do look for it.
Okay.
Propensity for a tire to roll off after flat is equivalent to all ISO compatible rims. So they're all the same shape within the nominal plus or minus tolerance. And then the tire really drives a lot of whether or not the beads stay in place.
I think at least my perception until recently was that if a tire is appearing on a hookless rim manufacturer's compatibility chart, it's that tire has been designed to be compatible with hookless rims. What I've learned of late is that there is no such thing as a hookless tire. There are hookless compatible tires, but there's no standard for a hookless tire. Question I'm trying to get to is, if a tire doesn't appear on that chart, previously what I would have assumed is that it's just not designed for a hookless rim. But is it actually possible that if a tire is not on your chart, you have tested, or Zipp has tested it in-house, and it has not met the requirements to be published on that chart?
Again, our chart is informed by the tire manufacturers. So we use our internal tire testing as validation for our rims. We don't use that as a plus or minus for what's on the chart. Okay. The chart is in the, we see, and Dave said this earlier, we see our job is to make the rim ISO compatible or ISO compliant. And so therefore the tire should fit. And so we rely on the tire manufacturers to do their due diligence as well. And that's one of the reasons why we supply them wheels, so that they can test their tires on our wheels.
Is there any issue or is there any requirement for brands to tire manufacturers to prove that they have done that testing to a substantial level that you can be, or Zipp can be confident in publishing a tire as compatible? I'm just thinking, because if the tire compatibility lives on the Zipp website, it seems like, to someone landing on the Zipp website and seeing a tire compatibility chart, I think it's reasonable for that person to assume that, Zipp have checked these tires are compatible. What's actually happening is the tire manufacturers are checking and then informing Zipp. Is there any safeguards or stop checks in place to ensure that they have performed those tests adequately?
We often will have conversations with the different tire manufacturers, and they will share how they're testing and what they're testing, and oftentimes, or sometimes, they will share, hey, we plan to do this test or that test, and we'll say, well, have you thought about doing it this way? And so sometimes they change their testing method. And we've seen that happen several times, where tire manufacturers have said we would like to test in this way, and not necessarily that we've seen a fault in their testing, but we've seen something that could highlight a variance that they may not be seeing. And so that's part of the sharing between tire and wheel manufacturers that we do.
I think it does highlight, though, the importance of ISO standards. And as I've said previously, or at least to my understanding, there is no legal requirement for a manufacturer of any component to adhere to ISO standards. I think there probably would be an issue if a manufacturer found themselves with a lawsuit to defend and they hadn't complied with ISO standards. So they effectively are, I think it's for everybody's benefit that we all adhere to standards. I think those standards, they will, both on the tire manufacturers, on the rim manufacturers, and even on the riders' point of view, there will be times that those standards are quite pesky. We perhaps know we could get they don't need to be as stringent, or they don't need to be as limiting. I'm thinking now from a rider standpoint in terms of the new rim and inner rim width and tire width standards. If I want to adhere to the rule of 105, that might not be possible on all rims going forward, and that would be frustrating if I already own those rims. But I think it does highlight why it's so important that the standards do exist. And the question I have to Zipp is, will we see an update to that compatibility chart to reflect the new standards, which now state that a 25 millimeter inner rim is not compatible with a 28 mil nominal width tire? Even if it was technically compatible previously, it no longer is. It seems to me like there's an update required there.
What I would say, Ronan, is that we're definitely looking at it. And, one of the things to keep in mind with standards is, and I'm going to use an analogy, right? So here in the United States, we have what's called the National Highway Traffic Safety Board. And they are the ones that set safety standards for cars. And so when they release and their standards evolve, just like ISO standards evolve. And so when they release a standard, that doesn't mean that every car on the market has to go back to the shop to be updated. That just means that moving forward, that standard is in place. And that's generally the spirit of the ISO standard and the ETRTO standard as well. And in fact, within the ETRTO, they maintain that previous standard data in the manual. So given our history of successful use with 28 millimeter tires on a 25, right now that's where our tire compatibility chart stands. And knowing that that's where it has been, that's something that we're also discussing both internally as well as with tire manufacturers, but no decision's been made.
I can understand that would be a difficult assessment to make. There's probably reasons to lean either way on it. I think I'm fair enough in saying, though, with so much sort of uncertainty and confusion around hookless systems in general for their use within a road setting, perhaps a definitive line that we can all adhere to is the way forward here, regardless of what was compatible in the past. And in the interests of reducing the amount of confusion rather than increasing it, perhaps that would be my argument for let's go forward with ISO the way it is, and hopefully try to resolve some of the confusion that exists.
Yeah, I think we can definitely agree on anything that can add clarity and reduce confusion for the end user is beneficial. Like you said, there are a lot of different facets to this that we're considering, but for sure, in the end, we want to be able to support the standard.
I might just wrap it up with a couple of quick questions based on the use of hookless systems on the road. Sealant or no sealant? I think it's an obvious one, but I'll ask it.
Sealant.
Definitely with sealant, okay. If someone did not want to run their hookless rims as tubeless, they wanted to run with an inner tube, provided they're using the correct tires, does the inclusion of an inner tube increase the maximum inflation? And I'm thinking, is that a way to sort of, if you've got rims that are hookless at the moment, you're feeling kind of nervous, would adding an inner tube give you some extra safety factor and maybe put your mind at ease?
Yeah, I'll say that adding an inner tube increases the maximum inflation pressure significantly, but you should never go over the 5-bar limit. If you want some peace of mind, certainly an inner tube will add, a huge safety factor, but definitely strictly adhere to 5 bars or below. And our testing in science shows that lower pressure is faster.
Okay. I'm I've been trying throughout this podcast not to get into the sort of performance realm of this discussion. So I'll not ask on rolling resistance and that now. That's perhaps a topic for another podcast. The other question I have related to this though is tire inserts and foam inserts. Is there any pros or cons to using an insert?
They make tire installation pretty difficult. Our impact testing doesn't really show they have much of an effect in terms of increasing impact resistance. We haven't tested every foam insert on the market, but our preliminary testing, we don't quite understand the use case. They seem to be very popular in the pro peloton. Right now, we don't have any reason to suggest you should avoid them, but they add weight. They're difficult to install, and we don't see really a change in impact performance.
And there's no change in terms of max inflation pressure or tire retention with a foam insert.
Yeah, it really doesn't interact much with the tire or the rim.
And the other side of it is it doesn't really allow for ride flat. So if the one thing that we counsel all of our riders, whether they're pros or they're end consumers, is if you have a flat, stop as soon as safely possible. Because if you want to ride flat, you may very well damage your wheels.
One thing I would add, maybe this again, because we're relatively new in testing inserts, this is more of a speculation, but if you're wondering why the foam insert doesn't really affect impact resistance, my guess is that it's directing load through the rim in a place that we didn't intend load to be directed, which is through the tire bed, more so than the uprights. So that we don't see a drop in impact results. We just don't see an improvement, and that may be the reason. In theory, it should help, but because that impact is now going through a part of the rim that's not reinforced, maybe we see a similar impact failure or impact energy.
And there's various different types of inserts available, and I presume they have various different mechanisms of diverting loads in that as well, and perhaps no mechanism in some cases. But that's again perhaps another question. When you've conducted that sort of analysis even further, perhaps we can pick that one up again. The final question I have for Zipp today is just, obviously the UCI are conducting a study at the moment. I'm not going to ask you to speculate as to what the outcome of that will be, because it's the UCI. What I might ask you just to sort of explain to us is what Zipp would like to see going forward. Is there a way to what Zipp would like to see as the outcome from that study, or by the UCI, or what Zipp would like to see going forward in terms of an update to the ISO standard, or how do we get to a point where the confusion around hookless that exists at the moment is dispelled, and that we're not hearing reports anymore of riders ending up on hookless wheels without realizing it?
Yeah, I'll start just by saying that we don't believe that either of the incidents that caused this media stir were related to hookless or our testing standards. But in a good faith effort, maybe Nate, can you share what we're directing our teams to do going forward?
Yeah. So what we've asked our teams to do going forward is to abide by the ISO standard strictly. And so, it's not an instantaneous change, because as much as we like to think that every team has thousands of every product just sitting around waiting for them to want to use it, it's going to take time for them to get tires. And so you will see Zipp sponsored teams or teams riding Zipp wheels moving to 30 millimeter tires on our 25 millimeter hookless wheels. So the 303 and 353. So that's something that we've done already proactively, just asking our teams versus relying on those previously proven combinations to just adhere to ISO as it's written. That was the first step that we've done. And I think from a UCI perspective, there's been a lot of effort around just having them simply state that the wheel and tire has to follow ISO and that we have to be educating the teams. And so maintaining a status quo of that is our preferred. From the perspective of confusion for a rider, I can't comment to other brands of wheels, but we actually take 2 steps to alleviate the confusion for riders. So when we deliver a wheel to a customer, whether it's through an OE or through a distributor to a bike shop. Every one of our wheels has one of two things. Either one, an orange sticker at the valve stem, or two, a big cardboard plaque that's attached to the spokes. And both of those have a QR code. You scan that QR code. That takes you to what we call our Zipp welcome page. And on that Zipp welcome page is our tire compatibility chart, our tire pressure calculator, our several instructional videos on how to install and how to set up a tubeless tire, as well as how to repair a flat on the road with a tubeless tire. So all of that exists today and has existed for quite a while on Zipp wheels. Ronan, I don't know if you immediately pulled off the orange stickers when you received your 858s, but if they're still there at the valve, hey, look at that. So give that a scan with your phone and
Yes.
take a visit to the welcome page and take a look at that. That's something that we've had in place since mid 2022, and it's something that it's constantly evolving with further information, further education for the rider, so that when they receive a set of Zipp wheels, hopefully they see that, hopefully they scan that code, and they can learn how to properly use the wheels.
I'd also like to add that Zipp definitely welcomes the discourse around rider safety in the World Tour, and we're eager participants in any of those discussions, as well as working committees for setting ISO standards, ETRTO standards, and we want to be part of the solution for sure. And generally, we've been an advocate for pretty conservative measures in these committees.
I think, obviously a QR code, I know what that is. I can scan it. I can go to that page and understand what I'm reading there. I know if I give that rim to my dad, he probably doesn't see the sticker. He probably doesn't know what a QR code is. And I'm sort of thinking of back in my days of working in a Ford dealership selling Ford cars. One of the things that we used to communicate to customers was you don't need to worry about is your car petrol or diesel, because the fuel tank, if you've got a petrol car, will not take a diesel nozzle at your forecourt pump. Is there any way we could get to a system like that where it's entirely foolproof, for lack of a better term, where you just simply cannot get the wrong tires onto a hookless rim? Or is there any extra steps that we could introduce to ensure that those mistakes don't happen going forward?
Poka-yoke, the manufacturing term for this concept, poka-yoke, means mistake proof.
Okay.
It's a little too geeky, maybe. That's a wonderful notion. I think that would be excellent to have a way of preventing people from using the wrong combination of products for tires. I think that would be a pretty long discussion to align people around that. But I love the idea. I just at the drop of a hat, I don't have a way to do that other than to say change the diameters of the tires. So instead of a 700C, we have a 720C for hookless or something. But right now, no, I don't know how we would accomplish that as an industry quickly.
Well, for what it's worth, my messaging going forward will be to let your rim dictate what tires you install on it, rather than the way we have all been working for a long time, which is to follow the tire width trends that we see in the pro peloton. So while manufacturers are trying to figure out a poka-yoke, am I saying that correctly?
Poka-yoke, you got it, yeah.
I'll keep communicating that message.
Yeah, until that happens, we're making every effort possible to communicate the compatibility on our website, on our product, with our dealers, and also with the OEs to make sure they're speccing the right stuff. I
think the concern for me in a way is aftermarket. When rims are sold on, most people won't be like me. They'll have removed that orange sticker. It has to be, I guess, a distinctive color, because then it stands out and the original user can see it. But that also probably lends itself to the original user removing it, and aftermarket users, or used market users, I should say, not seeing that. Anyway, we could probably go around in circles on that topic. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for being open and answering the questions I had there. And yeah, I think we'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ronan. Appreciate that.
Thank you for your time, Ronan.
Thank you.